I was halfway through reviewing a client's tax summary when my phone buzzed, screen glowing with a name I hadn't seen all week. Mom. I froze. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, the ticking wall clock suddenly louder than before. I knew she wouldn't call unless there was an announcement to make, or a reminder that I was still the other daughter. I stared at the phone as it rang and rang. Finally, I exhaled and picked it up. Danielle. Her voice came sharp and brisk, the kind that made me feel like I was 12 again and already disappointing someone. Hi, Mom. There's an engagement dinner for Brianna this Saturday, she began, skipping pleasantries like she always did. You're invited, of course. I assume you'll bring Noah. Of course. I assumed I'd be invited too, to smile in the back, maybe fetch ice, and be politely forgotten before dessert. I'll come, I said, after a pause too long for her liking. Good, she replied, already halfway off the phone. Please try not to be too casual with your outfit. There'll be family friends and, well, you know how appearances matter. She hung up before I could say a word. I looked down at my wrinkled t-shirt, then across the living room at the single framed photo on the wall. Me and Noah at the beach 2 summers ago. It was the only photo in our apartment. No wedding pictures, no family portraits, no history hung up to lie about harmony. Most people don't assume we're related. I've got my father's deep brown skin, eyes that speak more than I do, and curls I've finally learned to love. My mother, Helen, and my sister Brianna? They could be cast in a commercial for upscale hand soap. Light hair, delicate noses, skin untouched by heat or history. Mom had me when she was 19, with a college boyfriend her parents hated. He was brilliant, black, and gone before I turned 2. She rarely spoke his name. A few years later, she met Douglas, married into his respectable world, and had Brianna. That's when the picture-perfect life began. A new family, a bigger house, holidays with matching sweaters. I was there, of course. Always just slightly off frame. The front door creaked open. Hey, Mom, Noah called, setting his backpack down by the door. His curls bounced as he walked in, eyes scanning the kitchen before he spotted me still at the table. Homework done? I asked. He nodded and came over, placing a paper on the table. Math is good, but I've got a history question for later. I smiled and reached for my coffee. It had gone cold. Let's finish dinner first, then I'm all yours. He looked at me more closely. You okay? Mm-hmm, I said, standing up. Grandma called. He made a face. What for? Brianna's getting married. Engagement dinner's this weekend. His shoulders slumped. Do I have to wear a tie? I chuckled. Maybe just a button-up. They're not ready for your superhero tie yet. We both laughed, but the air between us stayed a little heavier than before. Noah sensed things quickly. He always had. Kids don't miss much when silence speaks louder than words. Do I need to be extra polite? He asked carefully. You're always polite, I said, smoothing his hair. Just be yourself. That's more than enough. He looked down at the floor, then back up at me. I just hope they don't embarrass us. His voice was soft. I couldn't answer. Instead, I pulled him into a hug, holding tighter than necessary. Outside the window, the neighbor's wind chimes started tinkling in the spring breeze. The tax file sat untouched. My coffee had gone cold. But in that moment, none of it mattered more than the quiet boy in my arms, and the storm I knew was waiting behind the door of a perfectly curated family gathering. Brianna's townhouse smelled like money and expensive candles, something woodsy and citrusy, probably from a brand I couldn't pronounce. Nothing felt warm, but everything looked perfect. The rug was pristine white, the walls a soft dove gray, and there were gold-rimmed glasses sparkling under curated lighting. Noah shifted beside me, tugging at his too-tight collar. It's fancy, he whispered, I nodded and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Try not to touch anything. Just then, Helen appeared, wine glass in hand, eyes flicking over me like I was a store mannequin she wasn't quite sold on. That color makes you look tired, she said. You used to wear navy better. I resisted the urge to adjust my simple teal dress. Instead, I smiled. Good to see you too, Mom. She turned to Noah. Be careful around the rug, darling. That one came from Italy. Noah, ever polite, nodded with wide eyes. But I saw his small shoulders tighten. He knew exactly what she meant. A wave of laughter floated from the living room. I turned and saw Brianna, radiant in cream chiffon, surrounded by guests like petals around a flower. She spotted us, walked over in heels that clicked like punctuation marks, and leaned in for a kiss on the cheek. Hers just brushed the air. Danielle, so glad you could make it, she said, her smile stretched but brittle. Noah, you've grown. He offered a small, hi, staying close to my side. This is Jason, she added, motioning toward the man now stepping toward us with a glass in one hand and a slight furrow in his brow. He was tall, handsome in a thoughtful sort of way, with dark eyes that flicked from Brianna to me, and stayed. I extended my hand. Danielle, I said. His hand was warm, his grip gentle. For a second too long, we held the shake. Then something in his expression changed, just a flicker, like a light turning on in a forgotten room. Have we met before? He asked softly. Brianna looped her arm through his and laughed. Jason meets a lot of people. He probably thinks you look like someone from work. But Jason didn't look convinced. He knelt to Noah's level. And you are? Noah, my son answered shyly. What grade? 5th. That's a great year. I still remember building a volcano for the science fair. Yours coming up? Noah smiled. We're doing the solar system. Jason's eyes warmed. Bet yours will be the best. Across the room, Helen cleared her throat, always on cue. Everyone were moving to the table. Dinner was a spread of perfection. Charcuterie boards arranged like magazine covers. Pasta served in porcelain bowls with gold trim. Wine flowing like it had a purpose. I sat between Noah and an elderly neighbor who couldn't stop raving about the floral centerpieces. Brianna, of course, sat across from Jason, flanked by bridesmaids already dressed in matching pastel tones. The talk was all wedding. Floral arrangements, caterers, dress fittings. Not once did anyone ask me a question. Helen clinked her glass. We're just so proud. Brianna has always made us proud. She turned her gaze to me briefly. And Danielle? Well, she's always been practical. That has its own kind of charm. A quiet pause. The kind that feels longer than it is. I smiled, sipped my water, and focused on cutting Noah's chicken. I'd learned long ago that silence was safer than sarcasm. Jason, I noticed, was watching me. Not in pity, not quite curiosity. Something else. He hadn't said much, but his eyes asked questions the table didn't have time for. After dessert, guests trickled out. I gathered Noah's sweater from the back of his chair. As we reached the door, Jason followed. He looked nervous, his hands deep in his pockets. Have we... He hesitated. Have we met before? Somewhere else? A long time ago? His voice was low, careful. I blinked. Maybe. I'm not sure. But my heart beat faster. On the way home, Noah talked about how the cake was good, but the tablecloths were too stiff. I laughed, even though my mind was elsewhere. After tucking him in, I rummaged through my closet until I found the old keepsake box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a faded card. The handwriting was neat but fading. To the woman who gave me dignity when I had none left. Thank you. Elise Reed. My breath caught. Elise, the hospital, the girl with the soft laugh and brave smile. And Jason, he was her brother. 10 years ago, I watched Elise Reed fight for her life with more grace than most people live with. She had this strange, stubborn light about her, like Joy didn't know it wasn't welcome in a cancer ward. She called her IV pole Frank, wore red lipstick to chemo, and greeted everyone like they were guests at her party, not staff watching her fade. I had just finished treatment myself. Not leukemia, like Elise, but something that changed how I saw my body and my time. Volunteering at the hospital was my way of giving thanks, I told myself. Truthfully, it was also how I stayed tethered. I needed to be around people who understood life was brief and precious. That's where I met her. And that's where I met Jay. He rarely spoke, always came late in the afternoon, stood in the doorway during Elise's sessions, hands in his pockets, eyes red but dry. I never asked if he was her brother. I didn't ask a lot of things back then. I figured if people wanted me to know something, they'd tell me. But Elise did talk. About everything. About how she missed dancing. How hospital food made her miss her grandma's mac and cheese. How her brother, Jay, was the only family member who didn't cry in front of her. "He pretends he's fine," she whispered one day. "But I know the sound he makes when he can't sleep." I'd bring her ginger chews and crossword books. Noah, then barely 5, would sometimes tag along on slow Saturdays. He'd draw planets and dinosaurs for her. Elise called him her art therapist. One day, after a long session, she squeezed my hand and said, "If you ever meet my brother outside of this hospital, tell him I'm proud of him." I hadn't thought of that moment in years, until now. Now, sitting on the floor of my small living room, I held the worn card in my lap. Noah was asleep in his room, his breath soft and even, like waves brushing shore. The only light came from the lamp in the corner. Dim, yellow, gentle. I'd pulled the old keepsake box from the top shelf of my closet after dinner when his words, "Have we met before?" kept echoing in my head. The card still smelled faintly of antiseptic and lotion. I opened my journal too, one I hadn't read in years. There, taped to a page, was a faded photo. Elise in her hospital gown, making bunny ears behind Noah's head as he held up a crayon drawing of Saturn. I remembered that day. He had insisted on coloring the rings purple. Beneath the photo, I had written one line: "Joy is a rebellious act." Elise proved it. And then it clicked. Jason Reed was Jay. That night, I sat on the couch with the card in my hands, the photo beside me, and a knot in my throat I hadn't felt in a long time. Not grief, exactly. Not even nostalgia. Just a quiet ache, like I had lost something once and found it again, only to realize I was no longer the same person who had held it. The next morning, my phone buzzed. Brianna. I almost didn't answer. But I did. "Hey," she said, voice bright but cold. "Just wanted to let you know you're not in the bridal party. We've already filled the slots." I said nothing. I mean, obviously we're keeping it close. Just friends and, well, family. I didn't ask who defined that word. She kept going. "But you're welcome to attend. You and Noah. Please just keep things quiet. You know how Mom gets." Of course I did. 2 hours later, Helen followed up. She didn't waste time. "Danielle, please don't make a scene at the wedding." I wasn't planning to. "Well, you have a way of drawing attention." "No, Mom," I said, voice even. "People just notice what they'd rather ignore." She hung up without saying goodbye. I folded Noah's school uniform that evening with fingers that moved on memory. Buttoned shirt, navy pants, socks with the little rockets he liked. The same way I used to fold blankets in the hospital, corners tucked, smooth lines, everything in order, as if neatness could stop things from unraveling. My phone lit up again. "Jason, can I call you later? I need to ask you something important." I stared at the message. My heart thudded once, then steadied. I typed back one word, Sure. I looked at the photo of Elise again, her eyes bright even in grayscale. I whispered, "Please remember me for who I was then, not what they say I am now." Outside, the streetlights blinked on one by one. I stayed still, card in hand, listening for something I hadn't heard in a long time. My own certainty. I kept telling myself it was just a ceremony, just a few hours. But I knew better. Nothing with them was ever just anything. The wedding venue in Chapel Hill looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. White tent shimmering under the summer sun. Soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. Pastel ribbons fluttering from the chairs. Even the heat felt curated, like it had been requested to match the peach-colored theme. Noah walked beside me, holding my hand tightly, his dress shoes pinching just enough to keep him alert. I had ironed his shirt 3 times that morning. He looked sharp, but tense, eyes scanning everything like a new student in a strict school. I wore the softest dress I owned, a modest sky blue. It reminded me of the sky in the hospital courtyard where Elise and I once sat, talking about life after pain. But here, under this expensive tent, it felt too quiet. Too plain. Helen greeted us with a glance and a nod. "Well, at least it's not too loud," she said, eyes flicking over my dress like a teacher checking a uniform. Then to Noah, "Please try not to run." There are fragile arrangements. We weren't even through the arch before being reminded we didn't belong. Brianna glided toward us a moment later. Her dress sparkled with tiny beads. Her smile was the kind that held its shape, but none of its warmth. "Danielle, so glad you came," she said, lips barely moving. "Your table is near the back. Just thought Noah might get restless during the photos." I nodded once. She turned away before I could respond. Noah and I made our way to our assigned table. It was close to the buffet but far from the center. Most guests at our table looked like people whose names didn't make it onto the official seating chart until the night before. As I adjusted Noah's bow tie for the 3rd time, Jason appeared, quiet as always. He bent slightly and gave Noah a soft smile. "You look great," he said to him. Then to me, "You look grounded. That's rare." I held his gaze for a second, unsure what to say. I just smiled back. The ceremony was short. Vows exchanged under the arch, petals tossed by flower girls in blush. Brianna beamed like a beauty queen, while Jason stood tall but distant, his jaw tight. At the reception, the music picked up. Wine flowed. People danced. We stayed at our table. Noah ate his chicken slowly, eyes wandering toward the dance floor where kids his age twirled in circles. I nudged his plate closer. Then the toasts began. Brianna took the microphone, her voice syrupy sweet. She thanked the guests, the vendors, the weather, anything that wouldn't talk back. Then she turned towards me. "And to my sister Danielle," she said, pausing for dramatic effect. "Living proof that you can be recycled and still somewhat functional." Laughter rippled. Some hesitant, some too loud. I blinked, heart stopping mid-beat. Helen, never one to miss her cue, stood beside her. "She's our family's starter pack," she added with a laugh. "Not perfect, but she got us here." This time the laughter was thinner, confused glances. A few guests lowered their glasses. My hands trembled under the table. Noah reached for me instinctively, his fingers wrapping around mine with a quiet desperation. I couldn't breathe. I didn't cry. I just froze, as if stillness might make me invisible. The music faltered slightly, then stopped. Forks clinked against plates. People shifted in their chairs. Jason stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He just walked to the microphone, took it from Brianna's stunned hands, and turned to the crowd. "That's enough," he said calmly. "This isn't love. This isn't family." He looked directly at Helen, then at Brianna. I came here ready to start a life, he continued. But not this one. Gasps echoed softly through the tent. I felt Noah's grip tighten. Brianna stepped forward. Jason, what are you? He raised a hand, not to silence her, but to steady himself. I'll speak my truth, he said, voice steady. And then I'll leave. The world didn't end in silence. It cracked open with a single sentence. This wedding is over. At first, no one moved. The breeze caught the edge of the white tablecloths, lifting them like shallow breaths. The golden hour light poured through the tent, golden and soft, at odds with the hard truth now hovering in the air. Jason stood tall, still holding the microphone, his shoulders squared. I could feel the weight in every syllable, each word like a slow unraveling of a knot no one had dared to name out loud. You all deserve the truth, he said. So does she. He turned his eyes toward me. Her name is Danielle. Some of you know her as the other daughter, the one who doesn't fit the pictures. But 10 years ago, when my sister Elise was fighting for her life, it was Danielle who sat with her, who made her laugh, who brought comfort when the rest of us didn't know how. I couldn't breathe. I had gone still in my chair, hands resting on Noah's shoulders, his body tucked close to mine. You gave my sister peace, Jason continued, voice low but clear. She called you her mirror and her hope. A murmur rippled through the guests. He turned to Noah now, and the softness in his eyes deepened. And you were just 5, bringing crayon drawings to her bedside. She said your smile was the last thing she held on to. You brought light into a room where everything felt dim. I felt Noah lean further into me. I wrapped my arm around him without thinking. Jason looked out at the tent, scanning faces, some confused, some ashamed, some pulling out phones. Brianna had gone pale, her hand clutching the edge of a tablecloth. Helen looked frozen, her lips parted, the glass in her hand trembling slightly. I didn't know who Danielle was when I met Brianna, he said. But when I found out, when I remembered, I hoped that kindness might run in this family, that the people who raised Elise's favorite human being might have changed. But today proved they didn't. Helen stood abruptly. Jason, stop this right now. He didn't flinch. Number You've silenced her long enough. He slipped off his wedding ring slowly, like it burned. The gold caught the sun before it landed on the center tablecloth with the softest tap. Gasps, then silence again. Brianna stepped forward, voice shaking. This is just a misunderstanding. You can't do this. On my wedding day? He turned to her with a calm I hadn't seen before. It's our wedding, Brianna. Or it was. She blinked. You're throwing everything away. For her? He looked at me again, then at Noah, then back at Brianna. I'm choosing what's right. I'm choosing truth over show. I'm choosing kindness over cruelty. He turned, walked slowly across the floor toward our table. My heart hammered. He stood in front of me, eyes steady. Can we leave? Together? Noah looked up at me with wide eyes, and then at Jason. Something in him understood. Without a word, he reached for Jason's hand. I stood. The moment I did, it was like the string holding the tent together snapped. Guests began whispering. Chairs shifted. A fork clanged against porcelain. Jason took my hand. I felt his fingers tremble for just a second. Then they steadied. And together, with Noah between us, we walked out. As we passed the rows of chairs, Helen's voice sliced through the quiet behind us. You'll regret this. Jason paused but didn't turn fully. Just glanced over his shoulder. No, he said softly. I finally don't. Outside the tent, the air was cooler. The world hadn't ended, but something inside me had changed, Not broken, just lifted. I felt tears slide down my cheeks, not from hurt, but from something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Some stories end with a kiss. Ours began with a cup of coffee, a quiet apartment, and a boy who finally slept through the night. It's been over a year since the wedding that wasn't, and life has grown roots in places I never expected. My office downtown is small but sunlit, with a wood-carved sign by the door that reads, Brooks Accounting. I still get nervous filing quarterly reports for local shops, but there's a calm that comes with being my own boss. A kind of quiet pride. Most mornings start with Jason brewing coffee while Noah rushes around looking for his left cleat. He's 11 now, taller, louder, and somehow more tender than ever. He was recently named captain of his soccer team. I framed the announcement and hung it by the door, right next to his first drawing of Saturn. Jason walks him to school most days, holding the thermos in one hand and Noah's chatter in the other. Some afternoons, they both come by the office to check on me, which usually ends with them distracting me with snacks and jokes. At night, our dinners aren't fancy, but they're ours. Jason grills, I prep salad, and Noah always insists on setting the table, complete with mismatched napkins and candles he claims set a mood. We've never been more ourselves than in these quiet, unpolished moments. In early October, we drove out to Chapel Hill. The leaves were just turning, copper and flame across the trees. We brought flowers to Elise's grave, lavender and white, her favorite colors. Noah brought a drawing of a tree with deep roots and tiny stars around it. She said I reminded her of space, he told me softly. Jason knelt beside him, brushing leaves off the stone. I kept my promise, he whispered. We're okay. We stood in silence for a long time. Not in grief, but in gratitude. Elise had started something she never got to see finish. But maybe that's how love works. It plants, it waters, and then it lets go. That night, back home, the three of us sat curled near the fireplace. Jason disappeared into the bedroom and returned holding a small box. He knelt, not in ceremony, but in honesty. This belonged to Elise, he said, opening it to reveal a delicate emerald ring. She told me once, when you find someone who gives more than they take, give them this. He looked up at me. You gave her peace. You gave me family. My heart swelled. I smiled through the tears. Yes, I said, but we've already been a family for a while now. We hugged, the three of us. No choir, no cameras, no matching outfits, just warmth, and the scent of cinnamon candles, and the sound of Noah yawning into Jason's shoulder. Later, as I turned off the lights, I glanced out the window. Snow had begun to fall. Soft, steady, quiet. A new season was beginning.